Now, the first part of the workshop today has to do with talking about drawing. And I want to start at the most basic. What is it that we do when we are drawing? Now, one of the theories of drawing, the start of drawing, was that in ancient Greece, this is the Greek origin of drawing. There was a young woman in love with a young man, and the young man was going away. And just before he went away, he was sitting in the room with a candle lighting him, and the candle made a shadow on the wall. So if we turn one of these away, where can we see it? We can almost see a shadow here. So what she did was simply to copy the shadow of the man on the wall. Okay, the way one can copy the shadow of the hand. Now, something very astonishing happens when we do this, when we make any of these marks. We have a shift of something that is both inside and out of the body. And we have an immediate splitting of the self into two parts, into two things. There's a sense before one makes the drawing, before one does any drawing, of how do you know that you exist? You're aware of your body, but kind of as soon as you leave the room, in that room there's an absence where you once were. There's no trace of you having been there. There's no way of knowing you were there. And one of the things that the activity of mark making, and drawing is simply a making of a mark, one of the things that does is that it gives one an external proof of existence. So I make the mark on the sheet of paper. Okay. This is something that is coming from me onto the paper. This is clear, all right? It's coming from my arm onto the paper, out of me onto the sheet of paper. But when I leave and turn away and go away, that remains. That mark remains. So it's a sense of an external proof that I existed, that I exist. Either of the boyfriend of the young princess, who when he left there was the trace on the wall where she had drawn his shadow, or in the case of any drawing that a child does, that an adult does, it's that sense of finding some way of pushing part of who you are out into the world and letting it stay there. And all the drawing that is done is an elaboration of this activity, of leaving a trace of yourself somewhere. And so it doesn't really matter what the subject is that is being drawn, what the theme of the drawing is. If one is simply then, we can put on these lights, that's good. If we're simply talking about making a drawing, finding some way of getting out from inside onto the sheet of paper as the first point. And the second point saying, well, the subject matter is not the core, is not the heart of it. There's something in the activity. Then one has to understand that it is in a physical activity that the importance comes, and that the thinking about the drawing happens as a physical activity. And that means that a lot of thinking about drawing or making drawing has to do with trying to understand the grammar, the logic, the energy of actual mark making. And when I went in the early 1980s to Paris to theater school, I realized I learned far more about drawing from the theater school than I did from the art school. And in some ways I learned more about drawing from the studies in politics also than the studies of fine art. Let me be more specific. When we make a mark on a sheet of paper, obviously we all make a mark. It's easy to make a mark. But the question is, what is the logic behind the physical mark that is made? How does one decide what is the mark to make? What's the nature, apart from the shape, but the actual impulse behind it? And in the same way that one can think, if you're working with actors, of different ways of acting, one can think about different ways of drawing. So maybe to give an example and to be more specific, we could think of when you're performing on stage, or when we're going through the world, but think of it as a stage performance. One can think of 6 different degrees of tension in your body. Okay, if we have no tension at all, obviously we're going to collapse and fall on the floor. So there are different degrees of tension we have within our body. And these, in a way, can correspond with different ways of drawing. So to go briefly through these different degrees of tension. The first degree of tension would kind of correspond to the lowest tension in the body, when you're like almost dead, someone dying of thirst in the desert, where the least action, the least energy to be expended is what's needed. And if you're performing on stage, you can say, well, there's a breathing that goes with that, and there's a kind of voice and way of speaking that's exhausted. And if one's making a drawing, one can say there's a kind of mark making, which is the minimum kind of energy to move the charcoal around the sheet of paper. So we can call that a sort of a level 1. Then a second level of tension, just within the same metaphor, would be something that's really relaxed. It's kind of like people walking, school kids walking along the street. There's a looseness in their limbs, there's a way of... So one could say, okay, it's not the same as being almost dead, okay, but there's a kind of a looseness in it. And with it, there's also a kind of breathing, there's a relaxed way of speaking and talking that one can have, that one has a sense continues without, there's not much tension, everything recoils. And one, by the same token, could find a way of drawing that uses a similar, a kind of a looseness of mark that has a looseness of tension in the body. That would be number 2. Then one could find a third degree of tension in the body, which corresponds to a kind of neutrality. You do an action from the beginning to the end, and that is all. If you say something or you breathe, it's because you need to explain something. So that would have a movement. I walk from here to here. I lift my arm. It's a minimum effort required, but to do something efficiently. And again, if you're drawing, that would kind of correspond to an architect drawing a point from one point to another, and you draw it. It's a very neutral activity. It starts in one position, it ends in another. So that would be the third. So in terms of being on stage, we've gone from almost being dead to being very relaxed to being very neutral. And the fourth degree of tension would consist of an intention. You go somewhere, you do an action because you want to go there. There's an impulse behind the movement. When you say something, it's because you want to explain something. There's a need to do something. So it's not just a neutral drawing of a line, it's the wanting of a line to be drawn. It's the need of a line to be drawn. So again, if we are drawing, it has to do more with a kind of energy that's going to find its way across because it needs to go somewhere. Okay? We can go to a fifth degree of tension, which in theatrical terms would kind of correspond to the Italian tradition of commedia dell'arte, of actors, and this has to do with a kind of delight and passion. So you go somewhere because you have to go there, you really want to go there. Your voice has a different energy, your breathing has a different energy. In Italian theater, it's all on the diagonals. It's like everything needs to be very shown and very diagonal, and it's a lot of energy that goes through it. And when one's drawing, this also has to do with a kind of an absolute energy. You're looking at someone and you're following exactly what they look like as they go, and there's a kind of a liveliness that goes from your arm, from the action, into what's being drawn on the sheet of paper. So that would be the fifth degree of tension. So again, just to recap, we've gone from being almost kind of dead to being very relaxed to being neutral, to needing to go somewhere, to being delighted to go somewhere. And the sixth degree of tension is when there is so much tension in the body that it can hardly move. In theatrical terms, I think it corresponds sometimes to no theater, to Japanese no theater. Everything is extremely tense and you can slowly hardly move anything and your voice holds all the tension in your throat and every gesture is... And in drawing or in mark making, that would again kind of correspond to an extreme tension that would shift the marks around. Now, I go through these series just to kind of explain what's not evident in a drawing when you look at it, which has to do with the kind of grammar of mark making, the grammar of what we do when we make drawings. And I'm sure we'll come back to this when we talk about puppet theater and about animation, these degrees of tension. That has to do very much with the first part of what I'm talking about, which is drawing as a physical activity, as a way of allowing the energy of the body to be part of what the activity means.